right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Down to Earth. This is a career talk series with a focus on learning, on the learning curve one is up against when they're starting a new role in a new environment. And so this year, we're reconnecting with climate and society graduates of 2022. And because at this point they have reached their 1 year mark. And so we're just focusing really on what they learned, how they learned to navigate these new functions and fields in climate. And so today we have Maya Kashapov, who graduated from 2022 and was one of the few people in our cohort who was very, very interested in carbon dioxide removal and was able to jump right into the industry. And so it's exciting to hear how that's been going. She's been working for a startup called Captura that does ocean carbon dioxide removal. And so she can share more about that. So actually it'd be great to, before we dive into like the questions focused on learning, it would be really good to get some more context, Maya. So I have like to begin with sort of like a three-part question, which is one, how did you get into CDR, carbon dioxide removal? Two, how did you break in? And three, what is your job?
Sounds good. Thanks, Gerald. Good to see everybody. Thanks for joining. CDR is a really exciting field for me, so happy to have so many people keen to hear about it. So CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, is an industry that aims to remove the accumulated emissions in the atmosphere. So really directly combating climate change that way by removing the CO2 that's contributing to warming of the planet. I found out about CDR in a documentary I watched junior year of college, and I was just blown away that nobody's talking about this sector and that I didn't already know about it because I was already kind of networking in the climate space and trying to figure out what my niche there would be that would be really impactful for climate on a large scale. So I became obsessed with it really right away and haven't looked back since. Since the day that I watched that documentary, I have been doing research on the sector and networking, watching other different documentaries, reading articles, listening to podcasts, really anything that I could do to teach myself more about the space. As nascent as the industry is today, it was even more nascent a few years ago when I first got into it. So really trying to get as much information as I could, and a lot of it was self-learning. Gerald, remind me of the other questions.
Yeah, so then how did you break in? And then what is the job?
Yes, sounds good. So the day that I watched that documentary, there were a couple of technologies talking about, what do we have in the climate toolbox to, get our emissions down and to secure a safe climate for the future. And one of those technologies was CDR. And the feature of that documentary was a company called Carbon Engineering, which was one of the three big carbon removal companies at the time and even today. So the feature of the documentary was their CEO, Steve Oldham, talking about the company and what they do and how their technology works. And the company at the time was small enough that the CEO's email, to his mistake, was still posted either on their website or, somewhere underneath the video or something like that. And I wrote him an email that night explaining how excited I was about the company and the technology and whether they had internships open or any way that I could get involved. So from that point on, like I said, it was a lot of self-learning involved, and I would email that CEO every single year since then, explaining what I'd been doing in the space and the kind of self-learning I'd been engaging in and the connections that I'd made in the CDR network. And sometimes I'd hear back and other times I wouldn't. So fast forward to my graduation from Columbia, it was just a week before that. And I saw that this CEO had posted on his LinkedIn that he was leaving carbon engineering. And I was so pissed off because I was hoping that, my master's in climate would really secure me a position in the company and put me in a position where, I was ready to take on a role in that company. So I wasn't happy that he was leaving the company, but he posted about him joining a new ocean-based carbon removal startup, which was a lot smaller than carbon engineering at the time and even today. So I messaged him and asked to get on a call just to hear more about the technology and why he decided to join this new company. And we chit-chatted about the new technology for about 15 minutes on the call. And then we started talking about job opportunities, and the rest was really history. So I've been at Captura ever since, working with that same CEO.
That's really wonderful. Your persistence really paid off. And so you've been working ever since. So I think that's going to be a helpful context to appreciate your learning curve, is to understand what business because I know you work on business development. So what does that mean? You know, what does that look like for you, your day-to-day, week to week?
Right. Yeah. So I joined the company as an intern, and then that eventually evolved into a full-time role. I was either the fifth or the sixth person to join the company. So we're up to close to 40 people now, I think. So the team has grown significantly, which is really exciting. But at the time that I joined, it was really the two co-founders, the CEO, and a couple of engineers. So I was really the first business person to join outside of the CEO. So we decided on a business development title because that was intentionally vague for the role. A lot of it was just being a jack of all trades and doing whatever is necessary to keep the company afloat on a day-to-day basis. So I started out doing PR and communications and administrative things and investor relations, and really just a little bit of everything. But since we've hired out more dedicated people, I've really been able to hone in on the business development role. So a lot of my day to day really is about building deployment partnerships and then also investor relations. So as we're moving the technology from the pilot phase and looking at what commercial scale might look like, there's a lot of partnerships that have to happen to allow that to be successful. So I do a lot of the first calls and the engagement with these potential partners. And then of course you need some money in the bank to back all this research that has to happen, and the demonstration of the pilots and then moving to the commercial stage. So a lot of my day-to-day also consists of having first calls with investors, figuring out what their interest in the company is, whether there's a good collaboration opportunity for us and how can they best help to support the business.
Thank you. So going into the questions more focused on, the experience and the learning curve, the first question's around initial expectations versus reality. So what were your expectations going into this job, into this startup, this nascent industry, and how did the actual experience differ?
Well, there were a lot of news for me. It's my first official paid gig in the CDR space, so that was a new experience. And then, of course, it's a startup, so the startup culture is very different than some of the corporate jobs that I've worked before. So I tried not to set too many expectations at the front because I really didn't know what I was getting myself into, which I think was part of the excitement for me, and part of the motivation of, doing something different every day and being in a position where you might have to pivot your strategy at any point. So I tried not to set any expectations, and I think that was the right approach because, I love the way that it turned out, and it's a really exciting place to be in because, like I said, it's ever evolving and it's really nascent, so we're kind of building the plane as we fly it.
And so was there a moment where you felt significantly out of your depth, and how did you navigate that?
One thing that comes to my mind immediately is just a couple weeks into the position, we were presented an opportunity to give a presentation at a New York Times climate conference, so pretty high visibility. And my boss, the CEO, approached me asking me if I'd like to do it. And at the time, I didn't really understand the technology that well and was still really new to the position. So I didn't feel like I was necessarily ready to take that on. And to his credit, he said, hey, only do this if you feel comfortable, no pressure, we don't have to do it, it's not a big deal. Knowing now, or now knowing what I know that I didn't really have the option. I think it was more of a test than anything else. So I'm glad that I actually ended up doing it and kind of dived into the deep end and, went along with it and did my best. And I think it actually turned out really well and I had a lot of fun. But like I said, I think that was definitely a test to see if I had the balls, so to say, to kind of jump into it and try something that was completely new and strange for me. So yeah, looking back, I think it was a good decision for me to make. I think it really set the groundwork for me to be a spokesperson for the company on a number of other occasions going from there.
Yeah, I actually remember that when it seemed like you had just started, and then all of a sudden you were the face of the company at this. I believe
Yes.
it was like New York Times Climate Forward and Morgan
Right.
Stanley combined events. And I think you were like speaking to an audience of investors and other people in the finance industry, right?
That's right. That's right. So I remember practicing for this presentation with my boss, and we laugh looking back at it now because I couldn't even say the word of our technology correctly. It was proprietary electrodialysis, and I couldn't say that word clearly. So it was just really funny because, yeah, I was totally diving into the deep end, like I said, and going for it, which I'm glad that I did. But it was freaky at the time.
Well, maybe, it just occurred to me that we didn't even talk about the technology yet. And so maybe this is a good moment, since you were talking about like having to actually tell people about it. If you could just briefly share with everyone what is the technology that Captura has.
Yes, absolutely. So, like you mentioned, we are a startup. We're actually a spin out of Caltech. So, both of our co founders are professors at Caltech that led the team that developed the proprietary electrodialysis technology that's really the secret sauce of our process. It's called direct ocean capture. So, we are essentially harnessing the carbon removal powers of the oceans to draw down atmospheric CO2. We do this using just seawater and renewable energy as inputs. And then the stream of CO2 that we produce can either be sequestered or stored underground for long periods of time and permanently and safely to generate carbon credits. Those help corporations offset their emissions. Or you can utilize that CO2 in a variety of different products like green fuels, cement, for example, and some other chemicals on the market that use CO2 as an input.
Thank you. Moving back into our normal questions, I was curious about your skills, the skills that you're using in your role. Like, what skills did you think would be most crucial, and what skills actually prove vital in your role?
Yeah, going into the job right after graduation, I don't know if you remember, Gerald, I was very much marketing myself as a policy and communications specialist in the CDR space. So that was kind of my expectation of the role that I would take on. But when I joined the company and had a conversation with our CEO about how I see my career evolving, from that point, he said that he kind of sees me more of as a business development person. So being involved with really making decisions about the direction that the company decides to go in. And I wasn't really expecting that, but I'm glad that I went with that because I think it is a much better fit for me. So despite my prep for the role as a policy and communications person, I ended up doing something totally different. I still use a lot of those policy and communication skills, of course, but taking on that business role was something really new to me. So more than anything, especially in a startup environment, especially in a nascent industry, just being able to evolve with the role and able to evolve with the company and take on new exciting tasks. And again, just diving into the deep end, I think was the most critical skill set for me. Being able to adjust and adapt to whatever happens on a day-to-day basis. A lot of times just to keep the company afloat is a big part of the job.
Yeah, because someone would look at you and think, okay, well, you're not coming from a business background, and then you're stepping into this role. So I'm sure people are curious, like, how do you learn what you need to learn in this role?
Day to day, yeah, you take it day to day. It's been an ever evolving role. As I said, it's changed as the company has grown and we've hired out more specialized people. But I'm very lucky to have a boss that's really dedicated to my own professional development. So he's worked very closely with me and has given me a lot of opportunities to learn from him. So we go to conferences together. He's allowed me to pitch to investors before. I join a lot of the conversations with our investors when we're doing fundraising. He's given me the responsibility of taking on first calls with deployment partners and potential investor candidates. So a lot of it is just trial and error. But I'm very lucky to have a boss who prioritizes my own professional development, despite me being an entry level employee. So most of what I know, I've learned from him.
Oh, that's fantastic. My next question is around feedback. Can you give an example of feedback that changed your approach to your job?
Yeah, I would say that I sit in a really funny place in the company because I'm technically entry level. I've just been at the job for close to a year and a half now, and I report directly to the CEO, and there's nobody else in between us. So it's kind of a funny power dynamic that happens there, and it's sometimes hard for me to determine when I can make a call and when I shouldn't. So a lot of the challenge is, stepping up to the plate when I need to, and then other times sitting back and kind of writing backseat. So a lot of the time, I would say that I feel like I should just be quiet and not risk saying something stupid versus putting myself out there and, being confident about what I know and what my experience tells me I should do. So I think the feedback for me, for my boss, a lot of the times has been, hey, just trust yourself. You know what you're talking about. I'm appointing you as this trusted person for the company, spokesperson, business person, whatever it is. So trust your gut and really put yourself out there. Don't be scared to kind of be in the spotlight and represent the company. So I'm learning to be braver about that and escape that imposter syndrome a lot of the time. Like I said, it's tricky with that really interesting power dynamic that exists. So I'm doing my best to navigate what exactly my role looks like as the company grows and as I become more experienced.
And what did you learn about yourself in the past year that you didn't expect?
I think it would be the same thing about the imposter syndrome. It's the CDR industry is one that I've been working to get a full-time role in for several years now, years before I even joined the climate school at Columbia. So I've been fighting to get a position in the industry, and it's been really tricky to get my foot in the door. So I would just say that I felt really out of my depth when I first jumped into the deep end. So being able to put myself out there has been a big part of it. I think I've just learned that I need to put my foot on the pedal sometimes instead of coasting in the back seat. So I think I've just learned to trust myself more than anything and try new things. And like I said, we're building the plane as we're learning how to fly it. So a lot of the times it's trial and error, and putting a few seeds in the ground and just really seeing which ones grow. So trusting myself to go through that process and just navigating things that navigating things the way that I know is right, and trusting myself to do that is a big part of it.
Yeah, and as we keep talking about, like, this is a very nascent industry, so it's not like a lot of people know how to do it. And so you probably know a lot more than a lot of people now, having been working in it. And I'm just curious if there's anything else you'd want to add about what are the unique challenges to working in this industry.
There are plenty. Like you said, it's a nascent industry, and a lot of the work in the industry as a whole, even though there are other similar companies that are competitors of ours, we're all trying to fight for the same thing. We're all fighting to resolve this climate challenge, and then also we're fighting to get the awareness about carbon removal tech out there. So, a big challenge, I would say, is just a lot of the communications and PR work involved with getting the word out about CDR. Um, you know, the IPCC has recognized that reducing our emissions is no longer sufficient. We also have to pair those emissions reductions with mass carbon removal if we're going to secure a safe climate for the future. So I think getting that message out has been a huge part of the job. We're still working to do it, and more people join the industry every day. But that's been a huge challenge in terms of communicating that and making sure that people are aware and are prioritizing carbon removal in our climate policies.
And do you have any specific, like for those here who are considering going into the industry, do you have any specific advice for them?
Yeah, I would say that you just need to get your foot in the door and become familiar with the industry before you jump into it. I started just by networking and trying to meet everybody in the space. It's still small enough to where, probably a good amount of time spent or dedicated to meeting people in this space will get you in front of most people. So it's also an industry that, like I said, we're working to get the word out about. So if you approach a lot of the people in the industry, they'll be willing to sit down with you and tell you about it and give you advice. It's a really friendly, collaborative space. So that's really good news. But I would say educate yourself as much as possible, watch the documentaries that are out there, listen to the podcasts, read the articles, understand the reports, get familiar with the policies. So that would be a first step, is just self-learning. Second step is break into the network, start to talk to people, get to know people, become familiar with who are the big dogs in the space, and then just talk to people that are already doing it. I'm happy to sit down with anybody here that wants to know more about the industry. So, just connecting with people that are already doing it is a big part of it.
Yeah, I remember meeting with you and I was like, oh, you should get to know everybody in this world. And like I felt like you literally did, because anytime I talk to somebody in the industry, I'll mention your name and they're like, yeah, we've had coffee. Like we know Maya, like we're a fan. So it's really wonderful. Well, I mean, I do have more questions, but I'll stop and open it up to the students here. If any of you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or chime in or add it to the chat.
Hi, I do have a question, and apologies if my background noise is quite loud. There's construction going on in the back.
You're all good.
Um, but thank you so much, Maya, for being here today. I'm Alicia. I'm a sustainability management master's student at Columbia. I don't particularly know much about the carbon capture space, and I don't really have a background in it. But I just thought, the topic of conversation today is really interesting, which is why I'm here. Um, I'm quite curious about your role within investor relations and just speaking with investors. Can you please elaborate more about like what are some of the like day-to-day responsibilities I guess you have within that space, and how do you identify and develop or think about how you would go about communicating to these investors that you think may potentially be interested in Captura. Yeah, how do you maximize your chances, I guess, from getting finances from these players?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Alicia. I think a lot of it revolves around emphasizing the value proposition that you have at your company. There's a lot of other similar carbon removal technologies, and you really have to make your differentiators clear. At Captura, I genuinely think that we have some very strong competitive edges that will put us position us as leaders in the ocean CDR space. So really honing in on those and making those clear to investors is a big part of it. It's also rare that you'll run into investors that are already familiar with a carbon dioxide removal space. It is very nascent, so it's tricky to put together your messaging that conveys that value proposition to somebody who's a finance guy and really doesn't understand how you can make money doing anything good for the climate. So, you're removing CO2 out of the atmosphere, so what? Like, where am I going to make money doing that? So you have to talk about the value proposition that exists there, and then also leveraging your differentiators from other in the space. So I think the combination of those two are really what get you investors and where people will start to really get interested in what you have to offer. In our investing round, our Series A that we closed earlier this year, it was a 13.5 million raise. A lot of that was getting both strategic and financial investors. So, having an experienced CEO that knows what to look for in investors is also really important. So we were making sure that we're not only getting investors on board that are, big companies that have balance sheets that can really support our piloting work, but also getting people who have the experience and knowledge to help us scale. So, with the energy industry, for example, they already have so much of that experience and that infrastructure that we need to scale. So working with partners like that has been really helpful for us.
Okay, I do have follow-up questions to that. I don't know if I can go ahead and ask, or if I should let Tian
Yeah, go
ask.
for it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I do have two parts to my question. The first part is when you talk about making your differentiating like values very clear. In that regard, given that a lot of these investors may not know like the technicalities of carbon capture, do you need to have a background knowledge or background knowledge in like finance, investing, and how to be able to speak to them in financial terms to highlight that value from a financial sense? And then my second question would be, you mentioned strategic and financial investors. And so for the investors that you work with that do have that knowledge within the energy space, have there been instances where there's like a tug and pull between what you guys envision Captura to be versus what they want as an investor strategically? And how did you manage that? I guess that differences in opinions or alignment and along those lines.
Yeah, those are good questions. So you absolutely need to be able to talk the finance bro language. If you're going to get your value proposition across well, then you have to be able to say, hey, this is the return that you're going to get on your investment. This is why this makes sense for you. This is why we're going to scale. And this is how we're going to be a low capital, high margin business. So you have to be able to talk those terms. And that's very much a big part of the learning that I'm doing from our CEO. He usually does the finance talk. I talk about the technology and the business itself. So that's still part of the learning that I'm doing. In terms of figuring out a good middle ground between the wants of your investors and where you want to go as a company, we've been lucky to work with big corporations that understand the value proposition within carbon removal and how Captura is differentiated in this space. And so they recognize that that's a unique opportunity, and they're really there to help us in any way that they can. So they've been great in asking us, hey, what do you need to scale? What kind of people do you need to work on the R&D and the engineering side? How can we best support you? So I think that was very much part of the scoping out of candidate investors is, okay, find somebody who is genuinely interested in your goals and where you want to go as a company, and not somebody that's just signing on to be able to, get a payoff from the investment a couple of years down the road. So that was very much part of the selection process, is finding investors that see that we're unique in this space and we have a lot of potential. So if you want to help us to get to that potential, it's beneficial for us to work together and find some middle ground, and just communicating that clearly and working collaboratively has enabled that for us.
Great, thank you.
Keon, I think you had a question.
Yeah, It was kind of you covered it. So I was gonna ask about like the Equinor partnership. I know that a lot of CDR companies shy away from oil and gas, which I'm not opposed to. Like I'm obviously on the other side of the argument, but you have Heirloom and these kinds of the companies that make big statements about not partnering with oil and gas. I guess my question is like, what's the biggest challenge navigating all of this uncertainty in like the nascent CDR industry? Like, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll say, at Captura, we really have a pragmatic approach to addressing the climate crisis. We're picking investors and partners that really have the experience and the knowledge and the infrastructure to really help us get to commercial scale. So that's why we've partnered with the energy industry to help us get there. And they've been really pivotal to allowing that to happen. So it sounds like your question is about what is the challenge involved in that sort of partnership?
I guess my question was more along the lines of how do you set your values in an industry that has no track record? No, I don't want to say no track record, but like it's still a bit of a wild west in terms of
Is. That's
yeah.
exactly the term that I was going to use. And that's how people talk about it. It's really the Wild West of the climate change solutions industry as a whole. We've seen a lot of NGOs come into this space that are really setting the groundwork for how to do this right. A lot of that has been Carbon 180, for example. They've been really great about setting standards for community engagement and social justice initiatives. So really prioritizing this in the approach that we're taking. After all, we're trying to counteract what the energy industry, the damages the energy industry has done on our climate since the industrial era. So if we're doing that to counteract what has already happened, then we want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's fair to everyone and not creating additional harms to vulnerable communities. So, a lot of those NGOs have been pivotal to setting the standards for how to do these things right. And, companies like Captura and other CDR companies are taking on whether that's commitments or, expressed interest in community engagement initiatives and just making it clear that we want to do this the right way. And, setting the standard for doing that is really huge.
Yeah, just to bounce off of my previous question, the ocean CDR industry is notoriously hard to, in terms of MRV, like it's the biggest question right now. I wanted to know more about like Captura's approach to ocean MRV, or are you kind of waiting for a standard to develop, for isometric, for instance, to develop a standard, or are you developing your own standard in-house and sort of publishing it in the meantime? What's your vision there?
Sounds like you've done your research. As Gerald said, MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification. So that's basically a term for, well, how do you know that you're doing what you say that you're doing? How do you know you're removing the carbon that you claim to be removing from the atmosphere? So very important standard in the CDR industry, because of course we want to be selling real carbon credits and making a real impact in the climate space. So for Captura, that's a little bit more straightforward than a lot of ocean CDR companies. We have a measurable stream of CO2 that comes out the back end of the process. So you can measure that CO2 with pretty standard measuring equipment. With a lot of other OCDR approaches, they are pulling CO2 into the ocean and they're storing it in the ocean. So they're relying on a lot of modeling to do that MRV, and it's hard to be very precise about that. For us, we can actually measure exactly how much that we're taking out, so it makes that process a lot more straightforward for us.
All right, awesome. Yeah, that was it.
Thanks.
Hi, I had just a couple questions. My name is Sophia, and I actually come from like a PR marketing background. And I worked with early stage tech startups in San Francisco and really want to get more into the climate tech space, specifically within business development and strategic partnerships. So I really appreciate kind of hearing about your journey and just kind of like the day to day. And yeah, kind of like solidifies that this is the path that I'm really excited about. But kind of more just generally, I know you kind of touched on like the day-to-day, but just in general, like what is your favorite part about your job, and what's the thing that like really excites you about this company? And what are you looking for the business to do in the coming years as it expands?
That sounds good. Yeah, I could definitely address those points. I just may have to come back to you to repeat those questions as I go through those responses. So on a day-to-day, it's a lot of first calls with candidate partners or investors. So being that first point of contact for anybody that's reaching out with interest in the company. I monitor our inbox of all these queries that come in. So if, somebody is expressing interest in the company, I'll take a look at who they are, what company they're at, what they're seeking to do and how they want to collaborate with us, and decide if it's worth a first call or not. And then we move on to a first call. I introduce the company, I introduce the technology, and then hear a little bit about how they want to work with us. If that sounds interesting, I'll do some internal research, maybe talk to our engineers to see if that partnership makes sense for our technology. And then if it looks good from there, we'll get an NDA in place, non-disclosure agreement, so that we can talk freely about the technology and the finance side of things. So we'll have a second call, get into the really hard specs of the technology and talk numbers that are involved with financing the company. If that goes well and there's still really good interest, then I'll follow up with our CEO and set up a call with him on it, and then they can get into an even deeper discussion. And then from there, we'll kind of take it where it makes sense if it's proving to be a good partnership. So that'll look very similar for both potential partners and investors. If our interests are aligned, then that kind of moves down the pipeline that way. Ask me those other questions again.
Yeah, and then just kind of like, what is your favorite part about the role? Because obviously you're kind of wearing many hats at this point, and will continue to do so for a bit. But what are kind of, as you narrow down, what are the things that you're really looking forward to, and particularly as Captura expands and scales?
Good question. I really do enjoy doing those first calls. I'm almost like a gatekeeper for the company. If I deem that collaboration to be worth our time, then they can kind of move through that process. But we have limited resources and limited time and limited people and limited money. So I have to be very careful about the calls that I make. It could be a waste of those resources if we decide to move forward with somebody that really doesn't make sense for us. So I enjoy taking those first calls and really scoping out, is this worth our time, and could this be a valuable partnership for us? I also really enjoy talking about the company. I've always been an advocate for the CDR space, as Gerald mentioned in our class. So very outspoken about the industry, and I'm very excited about its potential. A lot of times it's talked about, what could be one of the biggest industries of the next century. So it makes me very excited to just talk about the industry as it is. And then when I'm talking to people inside of the CDR space who are familiar with these technologies, I like to talk about Captura, because I genuinely believe that we have some really significant differentiators that will position us as a leader in this space. So just talking about the technology, talking about the huge potential that it has, and the impact that it could have on climate change as a whole really riles me up. So I enjoy talking about that and really getting the word out about the company. So being a spokesperson for the company has been really great. After I've had that New York Times presentation, I've warmed up to it a lot. So the more that I do it, the better that I feel about it. But just being able to convey what we do to other people, especially for people outside of the CDR space who have never heard about it before, are always like, what? You can take CO2 out of the atmosphere like that? So I always love that reaction. And I get excited about telling people, because they're always blown away that there's technology that's actually capable of doing that. And so that's also helping to build so much of that awareness that we need to get the industry in a position where it's really going to be a hugely impactful climate tool. So I enjoy that a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I think like you touched on a really important aspect of like the passion and the believing in the brand and in the company. And I think that that's what's so drawing to me about the climate tech space in general, is because all the people that are going into it really, really believe in the potential and possibility of the work that they're doing. And yeah, I like hear that passion in your voice and just how you're talking in your presentation. So yeah, I really appreciate that, and it's, I think, an important thing to mention as well. Thanks.
That's very kind. Thank you. Yeah, it's a cool industry to be a part of and a cool company to work at, because, you know, we very much use that to vet new candidates. It's like, if you're not excited about the technology, if you're not excited about the CDR industry, then you're not a good fit for the company. So it's a really cool experience to be part of, because you're not going to run into anybody and have a conversation with someone that is kind of dull and not excited about making it happen. So everybody is so motivated to get this thing off the ground, and everybody wants to collaborate with you. Everybody wants to work together. So just moving this thing forward together is very cool, because everybody's on the same page and we're all kind of helping to hold each other up.
I have a question that's not super related to the job search, but more rather the job actually itself. So I know Captura has a frontier pre-purchase agreement ongoing, and I've never heard like about like the flip side of these agreements. How you always see the headline and it gets us super excited in the industry, like, oh my God, they have a pre-purchase. Frontier is amazing. We love them. But do these agreements come with like strict terms? Is it hard to navigate them? And what does the application process look like? Is it I know a lot of people, a lot of companies get rejected very often. So congrats first off. But yeah, could you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I can only talk to Frontier really, because that's the only contract that we've gotten in the pre-purchase space. They have some really great people working for their team. They understand that a lot of these all of these technologies are nascent, and we're still in a piloting program, proving out the technology. And they're really there to help to like elevate the industry. The pre-purchases are set up that way, so you get the money up front and then you deliver the tonnage later. So you have the money to make that happen, to build out the infrastructure that you need, and then you deliver that tonnage down the road. So just the structure of those pre-purchases is set up in a way where they want you to scale, they want you to deliver that tonnage, and they make that really clear. And the entire process is, you know, we're really there to help you. You know, anything that we can do to support is something that we're happy to do for you. So they're really open-minded about, hey, if you want to approach us and you have a question for us, if there's anybody we can connect you to, they're really happy to do that. So we're really glad to be working the Frontier team. They're really great. They're also pretty flexible about how the agreement turns out. So of course, there's a contract where you are aiming to deliver this tonnage, but they're flexible. They work with you to set up that contract. It's very collaborative. So they involve you in that process. It's not just, you know, here's the things that you have to do and here's the money to do it. It's a very interactive process with many stages of iterations that allow you to really make the contract achievable, and not just something out in the future that you don't know if you'll ever do. So Frontier has been really great. Remind me of your second question.
That was it, practically. You answered, and that's good to hear. Thank you.
I just wanted to add, for those who don't know what Frontier is, it's a group within the payment company Stripe, and Frontier is the climate team, and they're trying to accelerate the tech adoption curve of CDR companies. And one way that they do that is through advanced market commitments, meaning that they're approaching these startups and saying, like, we will guarantee you business.
Yeah, so they're really helping to set the demand for carbon credits far in advance, so that they're really spurring the industry and kind of jumpstarting it now.
Yeah, it's similar to how we got like the COVID vaccines.
Gerald, if we have
Uh,
extra time, I'm happy to walk through any other questions that you have, unless somebody was about
Yeah.
to pop in.
Oh yeah.
yeah, I had a quick question. Is there anything you don't like about working in the industry? Like, is there a part that you wish wasn't there?
Um, Nothing comes to me right away. Um, I think there's a certain security that comes with working at a large corporation. There's a very detailed plan for how the next fiscal year will play out. There's very strict goals set in place where exactly what has to happen within that year, and there's really not a whole lot of wiggle room there. So I think that's comforting for a lot of people, but that is not the case in a startup environment. One thing that my boss says a lot is the only thing that we know about our plan is that it's wrong. So your plan is always evolving, and you just have to know how to adapt when something doesn't go the way that you expect. So for some people, maybe that's a downside because there's a aspect of the unknown, and anything could happen on any given day, and you just have to adapt to it the best that you can. But for me, that's part of the excitement of the job. That's a benefit. So that's the only thing that I would call out, but it really depends on the type of person you are and how you approach it. For me, that's definitely an advantage.
Amazing. Yeah, nothing comes to mind either, honestly. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I do have another question now. I'm just curious, I don't know if you've been involved in hiring at all, or I guess work closely with other colleagues who are involved in hiring. I'm curious, are there any candidates or instances where you've noticed um, like shortfalls that candidates have? So for us, still being in the program, what can we do to improve our chances of getting in to, startups or, companies like Captura that where we may not necessarily have that background experience in it yet, and that network of contacts.
Yeah, good question. I mentioned earlier that I think passion and dedication for this work is arguably the most important thing that we look for. Gerald mentioned that I do not have a business background, so I'm figuring it out as I go and learning from people that are really experts in this space. So I've been really fortunate to be given that opportunity, but I think a lot of that is backed by the commitment and the passion that I have for this space. So I think I've positioned myself well in that way, and that's really gotten me far. So if you are able to demonstrate that and you genuinely feel that way, and that shines through when you're talking about yourself and your interests, then that's a huge advantage. And that's absolutely critical to working in the startup environment, especially in CDR. I think I mentioned this before, but we are not interested in candidates that don't have that characteristic, that trait to them. So that is such a big part of the job, because it can be tiring, making these pivots all the time, and adapting to all these crazy things that are coming at you. So you have to maintain that passion if you're able to maintain the stamina to keep going. So that's a huge part of the job. The second part of your question?
Oh no, I think that was it.
That was it. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
I think just showing that this is something that you care about and you're willing to fight for is a huge part of the job. I think you mentioned, what can you do as a current student? Just self-learning is so much of it. Demonstrating on your resume that this is something that's important to you and that you're dedicating time to. I have no formal training, so to say, in carbon removal, but a lot of it, like I said, is self-learning. And then I also found an online certificate that you can get in carbon removal on EDX. It's an online education platform. And then there's a certification that you can get through Air Miners, I believe, which is a volunteer CDR community. So just scoping out those opportunities, becoming involved with ways to volunteer and help out in this space goes such a long way, because not only are you getting valuable experience, but you're also interacting with these people that a lot of times are the decision makers. So getting your foot in the door that way is a huge first step. And then from there, you can build the connections that will take you a step further.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then also going off that last question, specifically for CNS students, obviously we're winding down our first semester and going into our second one, and it's such a whirlwind since it's like 1 year. But would you, yeah, I'm like, what is happening? But what would you suggest in terms of classes that really helped you kind of like build the skills that you're learning now and feel more confident in the role? I'm thinking of taking the LCA and the GHG accounting courses, and maybe this is more of like a separate conversation, but I would love to kind of pick your brain to see what courses you found extra helpful, or ones that you wouldn't have thought to take but were really happy to take, or ones you wish you did.
Yeah, I think there are three that immediately come to my mind. I was already focusing on carbon removal tech when I started at Columbia. And so a lot of my navigation was finding other courses related to that I could build on. One course that I took was called Carbon Capture, Sequestration, and Utilization, I believe it was, CCUS, with Professor David Goldberg. He's an expert in this space, a big name actually. So if you get a chance to connect with him, that's really fantastic. The other one that I would recommend was called climate change and international relations or something like that. It's through SEPA, and there's a really fantastic woman leading the class, and it's seminar style. There's about 15 people in the class, and you actually have to write some, I think if I'm remembering correctly, you have to write some sort of proposal to explain why you deserve a spot in the class. So there's actually cuts that happen at the beginning of the class, and you have to prove that you're a good candidate to be in that class. And it's done forum style, where every week there's a new topic of debate that comes up, and you have to be prepared with arguments, and you sit down and basically have these negotiations or discussions on an open platform with all of your classmates. And it gets very personal sometimes. It's a lot of fun. So I would recommend that class. And then the last one is I think it was called International Diplomacy class. It's also set up in a similar way, but it's even more intense. There's like 10 people in the class, and everybody has very strong opinions, and it comes from different backgrounds. I believe it's through SEPA as well. But I was the only climate person in that class. So that was really interesting, because we had a week where we were focusing on climate change solutions, and I was so gung-ho about it. And I was just interested to hear what other ideas other people had. So that was really important for me. And a lot of it was learning about how do you position your argument in a way that's going to resonate with people that have no previous experience or knowledge in what you're so serious about. So again, it comes back to the value proposition. How do you convey the importance of what you care about to somebody that is probably not interested in that at all to begin with, and how do you win them over with that argument? So a lot of that, I think, was debate style courses that helped me to develop the skills that I need to convince other people that CDR is important and you need to pay attention to it.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. It actually, that the last little bit reminds me of a book that's actually been on my list. It's called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And yeah, that's something that I would really like on my reading list. But what you're saying really holds true, I think, especially within the business development partnership space. So thank you.
Yeah, huge part of it.
All right. Well, it looks like we're basically at the end of the hour. I guess my last question for you is, we've been looking at the past year. Just quickly, what are you, and Sophia, I think you kind of asked this question, so I'm going to ask it again. What are you looking forward to? Like, what's next in terms of your role at Captura and Captura?
Yeah, it's always an exciting time because you never know what might happen tomorrow. Right now, we're in a really critical stage of growth for the company. A lot of startups go down in this stage when you're moving from the demonstration and pilot part of your company to actual commercial deployment where you're getting to market. So figuring out that strategy has been really interesting and also challenging. So we're navigating that for the next year or two as we're wrapping up design work for our third and last pilot, which we're going to install in Norway next year. And then from there, figuring out what does commercial scale look like and which partnerships make sense. So that's been a big focus for me the last couple months and will continue to be for the next year or two. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that plays out and playing a pivotal role in that work. But once we get to commercial scale, I'm excited to show the world the potential that our technology has and just making it clear that we can have a real impact on climate change with CDR and technologies that make sense and can prove low cost and large scale. So I really think that we have the raw ingredients to make that happen. And I'm looking forward to showing that's going to happen.
Well, thank you again so much for taking an hour to be with us and to share what your past year has been like. It's been really fascinating. And thank you all for joining us and for being so engaged on this topic. So I hope everybody has a wonderful day and weekend. And I'm sure you can find Maya on LinkedIn.
I'm very
I'm sure.
active on LinkedIn. You
Yeah.
can.
Yes, absolutely. So please, go ahead and connect with her on LinkedIn, follow her. I love your updates, Maya. So, all right. Well, thank you again. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good
Thank
to meet you
you.
all.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.